It's coming through some. We'll work with it. If it ends up kicking on louder, I'm gonna apologize ahead of time. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank y'all for being here. We're gonna be in Mark 2 in just a moment while they're figuring this out. Like I said, you guys wave your arms in the back if you think you got it figured out, because I don't want to blast people. So, glad you're here tonight. We've finished our study on the parables, and so what we're going to do now is I've got two options. I didn't really hear much from people, so I'm going to give you two options. If I don't hear from you, then I'm going to take that as you don't care either way. But if you have a preference, let me know what you'd rather do. The first option is starting next week or the week after, we'll kind of work through a book called Portrait of God. And what this will do is be a companion piece to go with Sunday nights. Sunday night we're going to start going one book a week through the whole Bible. Some books will take a couple of weeks, like Genesis is a big book. It'll probably take 2 Sunday nights. But each Sunday night, we'll kind of go through a book of the Bible, hit the high points, give you the key verses, the key points, the main takeaways, the practical applications, key stories, all of that. When was it written? Who wrote it? Just give us a fundamental understanding of every book of the Bible. I've got all of the binders, so if you did not tell me you wanted one, I should have plenty for everybody to have one. Husbands and wives can have their own. We're being that generous. Now, if you want to share, we're not going to say you can't, but you don't have to share. With that, the Portrait of God basically will go deeper into what we're doing on Sunday nights. There's about 20 chapters in the book, and like the first chapter is kind of an introduction, but then the second chapter is Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So it kind of zooms in a little bit on what we're overviewing on Sunday night. Now, obviously, Sunday night is going to skip ahead probably through this, but this would just kind of be a companion piece to that, and it's really an overview of the Bible. It says, viewing the divine through his work of redemption. And so it just really breaks down the summary of the whole Bible, working through different sections of the Bible. So it begins with the world prior to sin, the background of redemption through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. It looks at the 40 years in the wilderness, unbelief, 1 year at Sinai, the united kingdom, divided kingdom, kingdom of Judah. So it really dives in deeper and would be, like I said, a good companion piece to what we're doing Sunday nights. The other option, if you don't want to do that, is there's another book that I've been wanting to do a class on. I just haven't done it yet. It's called Hurting with God, and it's a dive into the Psalms of Lament. The Psalms of Lament. So we could do a study on those Psalms in particular. And I'm going to do that at some point. That's the plan, at least, Lord willing. So whichever one you decide that you want to do, it doesn't mean the other one won't be done. It'll just be done maybe after we conclude whatever's chosen. So you can vote now if you like, or you can just come and tell me after class before you leave if you don't want people to know your vote. But those are kind of the two options, a study through the Psalms of Lament or a study that kind of dives a little deeper into the whole Bible and connect that with our Sunday nights. Either one works for me. I'm excited about either one of those. So just think about it, and we'll kind of come back to that at the end, and you can kind of let me know what you think before you leave tonight or before next week. Just let me know within the next week what you would rather do, and we'll kind of go from there. Now, with that being said, tonight I want to talk about, remember we've said this before, but when you read through the Gospels and you're looking at the life of Jesus in the Gospels, right? We call them the Gospels, and that word is the good news. And basically every one of them, they're not individual Gospels in a sense. They're the Gospel, but they're individual accounts of the Gospel, right? It's the same Gospel message, but it's told from the perspective of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke refer referred to typically as the synoptic gospels because when you read their writings, they have a lot of the same things. John has some different things that are going on in his gospel. That's not contradiction. It's like if you and me experience the same story, the same situation, and then we're trying to relay that to someone else. Well, the way I tell the story will be affected by what I've been through in my own life, by my own experiences, by things that might be going on in my life at that point in time. There's a lot of things that might affect how I tell the story. And there might be little details that stick out to me that don't to you. And vice versa. Well, that's similar to when you look at the Gospels. They're not contradicting each other. They're inspired and they're telling truth, but they're telling it from different viewpoints, from their experience being there. And so that's kind of what we come to with the Gospels. It's one gospel message, but you have these 4 accounts of the gospel that are talking about the life of Jesus, the life he lived, the death on the cross, the burial, the resurrection, all of these things. And you see his ministry and his teachings. So when you're reading the Gospels, you really should always look at 2 questions. There's others as well, but 2 big questions. What do I learn about Jesus in this text? And what do I learn from Jesus in this text? When you're reading the Gospels, the story of Jesus, there's something that we learn about him, or some things, and there's something or some things that we learn from him. And that's what we should look at when we come to the Gospels. They are narratives, meaning they're telling a story of something that happened. They're different than if you go and read an epistle like Galatians or Romans, these books that aren't narrative. They're not being told in a story format. So with that in mind, what we learn tonight as we look at Mark 2, we're going to look at verse 13 beginning through verse 17, is we learn how to win friends and influence people. That's what we learned from Jesus from these verses in Mark 2. So let's look here, and then we'll kind of break it down and look through this text a little bit deeper. So beginning in verse 13 of Mark chapter 2. Then he went out again by the sea, and all the multitude came to him, and he taught them. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he arose and followed him. Now it happened as he was dining in Levi's house that many tax collectors and sinners also sat together with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many, and they followed him. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eating with the tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, "How is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." When we talk about winning friends and influencing people, we're talking about something much deeper than just having more friends in our lives. We're talking about how to glorify God in my relationships with other people. In everything that we do. Now, as a Christian, not all of life is worship, right? When you're shopping in Walmart, it's not worship. But in all that we do in our lives, we're aiming to honor and to glorify and to praise God. And so when we're talking about glorifying God in this text, we're learning to do that through our relationships. A man that worked at a flour mill, he would go to the grocery store and flour would fall off in the aisles. It would fall off on the shelf, you know, because when he's working in a flour mill, what's getting all over him all day? The flour. So when he leaves and he goes out, everywhere that he goes, that flour's falling off of him. You know, I've used the illustration before of like a coffee cup, right? And if you fill up a cup with coffee and someone bumps into you, water doesn't come out, Sundrop doesn't come out, CoC doesn't come out, but coffee does, because that's what you put in the cup. And the idea being that as we go through life and life kind of bumps into us and we go through these different things, that's whatever we put into us is what's going to spill out of us in those moments. So if we filled ourselves, we always tell our kids, garbage in, garbage out. That's the idea, right? If we fill ourselves with the junk, then when the hard stuff happens, when the storms happen and we're getting kind of beat up and we're getting bumped into, that's the stuff that comes out of us. And so the whole idea of memorizing Scripture, as we've said before, is not about saying, look what I can quote. It's about storing up the Word of God so that as I go through different things, that's what comes out. You look at people that have great faith and they maintain their faith through really hard situations, and you say, how? Because they were preparing themselves, and they're able to endure. They've been storing up. And so whatever you're putting in is what spills out. Ask yourself, when you go out into the world, and when you go to the store, or you go to work, or you go wherever, what are you leaving behind? Well, it's the stuff that you've put in. It's the stuff that you've surrounded yourself with. So is it the stuff that you want to leave, or are you leaving behind maybe something you hope people don't remember? Something to think about as we kind of begin. This is the first time we encounter the Pharisees in Mark's gospel. Remember, Mark's gospel is a gospel where it's all very immediate. Matthew 4, verses 1 through 11, is the story of the temptation of Jesus, right? In Mark, it's one verse. One verse. It's almost, his favorite word is the word immediately. It's like a kid that's really excited trying to tell a story. And now I'm not taking away from the book. I'm just saying that's how it reads. You know how a kid's like so excited they just keep saying and then, and that's kind of the idea with Mark. It's just very fast paced. That's why a lot of people like it. There's only 16 chapters. You can read it pretty quickly rather than if you go to Matthew or Luke or John. And this is a book written by a man whose name means the hammer. It's powerful, it's quick, it's to the point. And this is the first time in his gospel in chapter 2 where we encounter the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees, these people like to bind where God did not bound, where God had not bound. They were very legalistic. They legalistically enforced and imposed their rules on other people. They enjoyed the power they shared over the people of the day. They did their best to live by the oral traditions. They would be to the far right of center. If this is center, they would be way far right in their ways of thinking. Now, for us today, our goal is to be in the middle, be in the center. Meaning, we're not binding things that are not bound. That's sinful. You see, sometimes we're so worried about being too far left, we don't realize that if we go too far to the right, we wind up, as Pharisees, we wind up being sinful. Just as sinful as if we go way too far to the left and we find ourselves in the camp that's labeled liberal, right? So we got to be careful. We want to bring a balance and find the middle. Not binding where God hasn't bound, not loosing where God hasn't loosed, just obeying God. Now the Pharisees struggled with that. The scribes, these were the law men. They gave a lot of attention to what was called oral tradition. And after the life of Jesus, sometime in the 2nd century or so, they encoded all of these oral traditions in, if you've ever heard of someone reference the Mishnah, that's what that is. So despite those that we may encounter, we can still have great influence on others. Jesus encountered a lot of different people from really bad backgrounds, from good backgrounds. So despite those we may encounter, we can still have great influence on others. Influence is the power we have to inspire the lives of others. And that's what we find Jesus doing in this text that we just read tonight. He's influencing people. He's inspiring people. So what do we learn about him? Question 1. What do we learn about Jesus here? Crowds are gravitating towards him. He is so popular right now because he's healing people, he's teaching people, and people want to come and see it. Some people want to come and experience it. Some people want to bring their friends to experience it. A few verses prior, right, at the beginning of Mark 2, you have the 4 friends that bring their paralytic friend to see Jesus, and they have to lower him through the roof because the crowd is so massive. Remember in Matthew 13, as Jesus is telling these parables, in that setting there in Matthew 13, he finds himself up against the water, and he actually gets in a boat to kind of create some distance between him and the people so he can teach. And then he begins to teach these parables in Matthew 13. And so he's surrounded by all these people. Crowds are gravitating towards him. And among those is an individual sitting at the tax booth. Tax collectors had a fairly sticky reputation in that day. The issue was the tax collectors would gouge the prices, right? They had a certain amount they had to give to the government, and then they would pocket the rest of that. They would choose sort of arbitrary ways to do this. It seems as though the government in general didn't really care as long as they got their money, and the people who were being taxed didn't have a lot to say in the matter because the collectors had the government backing them. It's interesting. Go with me to Luke 3 for just a second. Hold your place here in Mark 2. In Luke chapter 3, Verse 12. Then the tax collectors also came to be baptized, and they said to him, Teacher, what shall we do? What does he say to them? Collect no more than what is appointed to you. So that gives you insight into what their struggles were, part of their struggle here, right? So the tax collectors were known as being dishonest among the people. Someone wrote that tax collectors couldn't bear witness in the court of law because of their dishonesty. So think about that. That's their reputation. In their court of law system, the tax collectors could not bear witness because they were viewed as so dishonest. Zacchaeus in Luke 19, remember what he says to Jesus? If I have defrauded any, or if I have taken from any, if I've stolen from anyone, I've given back so much more. I've tried to make amends in that respect, in that regard. This gives insight to what tax collectors were known for doing. They would engage in legalized extortion, pretty much. So that's the tax collector group. And it says that he sees Levi, of course Levi being Matthew, and as he sees Levi, the word there is he gazes at Levi, and he's sitting in a tax booth. Now, the tax booth is positioned more like a toll or so to impose tax on customs and things as they're traded through this area. They would have a quota that they had to give to the Roman government. Then outside of the quota, they'd levy tax in addition to that and pad their pocketbooks. That's how they did. That's how they tried to cheat the system. And he's sitting in the tax booth. So this gives the idea that he's sitting there and he's participating in the results. So he could be defrauding people in this situation. Levi is sitting there doing his job, and Jesus goes to him and gives him an imperative, this command. What does he tell him to do? Follow me. Now, he gets up and goes, right? But do we ever stop and think about what some of these people leave, right? He goes and he leaves. Think about what he had to leave. He left his job. It was a job that was detested by others, but he apparently probably had good money because he was pocketing a lot of that, more than likely, based off his situation and their reputation. So he's leaving behind a job, and he's leaving behind what he knows, going to an unfamiliar. And unfamiliar is uncomfortable. In fact, that's why we stay stuck in our ruts in the church. Unfamiliar is uncomfortable. So if it's uncomfortable, it must be wrong. That's not right. That's not right at all. Sometimes it is wrong, but not every time. Unfamiliar can lead to being uncomfortable, and that can make us feel, oh, then we shouldn't do it. We just need to be careful with that, because that leads to the binding where God has not bound, or loosing where God has not loosed. We don't want to be guilty of either. And so you think about what he leaves. He leaves the comfortable. He leaves what he knows. And you think about the disciples. They were fishermen, right? That's what they knew. And what do we do when we go through something difficult? A lot of times we go back to the comfort of what we know. And in John 21, remember that Jesus has appeared to them twice already, and he's about to appear to them for the third time since the resurrection. But in John 21, they have tried to take all this in. They're overwhelmed, and they go back to fishing because it's what they know. But they don't catch anything. They spend all night doing what they've done most of their lives and come up with nothing. And this is where Jesus appears to them the next morning and tells them to throw the net again. And Peter and John realize it's Jesus. Peter jumps out in the water, swims all the way back to the shore. They have breakfast by the sea. But they did what we do. Went to the comfortable. They left behind what they knew, all the disciples. Why do you think Jesus gives such great warning for us to make sure that we count the cost before we actually decide to become a disciple? There is cost involved. If following Jesus has not cost you anything, you need to ask yourself, are you following Jesus? Because it does cost. Now, in Luke 5:28, it says that he left everything. Not just Matthew, but there are other unsavory people in this situation too. There are many tax collectors and many sinners here in Mark chapter 2. Now, we've talked about what we mean by the tax collectors. But what is meant by sinners? Now, you would say, well, people that sin, right? But it's maybe a little deeper than that right here, because these would be people kind of deemed the worst of society. It's not just, oh, this person over here, stole a pack of gum from the store the other day. Now, I'm not saying they had gum then. I'm just saying, it's not something like they did something they shouldn't have done. They would be labeled the worst of the worst. So Jesus goes to sit with these people, the tax collectors who everybody despised, and the worst of their society in terms of their actions, their choices, their behavior, those things. Look hold your place again in Mark 2. Look back at Matthew 21, just a few pages back. Verse 31. Says, which of the two did the will of his father? They said to him, the first. Jesus said to them, assuredly I say to you that tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but tax collectors and harlots believed him. And when you saw it, you did not afterward relent and believe him. Notice what is said there in this telling of the parable of the two sons, beginning in verse 28, Jesus references the tax collectors and the sinners, the harlots. That's the people he's labeling here, he's mentioning. Now, what is sin? That's a question for you. What is sin? Transgression of what? Of the law, right? Of God's law. We typically talk about how sin is to miss the mark, and it's an archery term, right? And so it really kind of gives you the idea, this is God's word, it's God's law, right? So to sin is, if you have the Bible here, and our mark, our goal is to do what God says. When we sin, we're missing that. We're doing something that God did not say. We're going too far one direction, right? We're missing the mark. That's the term that's used. So you have God's law, and as His people, we should want to live for Him and obey Him. So we sin when we disobey the law, when we miss the mark when it comes to the law, when we transgress the law. So 1 John 3 says whoever transgresses the law, that it describes it that way. Sin is violating God's law. So we're reading about tax collectors and people who violated God's law here in Mark 2. They weren't sinners because they weren't going to synagogue and reading their Bibles. These were the worst of the worst. Now I know they didn't have the Bible like we have today, but I'm just putting it in our terminology, right? Verse 16 of Mark 2 says, and when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eating with the tax collectors, then they said to his disciples, how is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners? So the cultural idea here of sitting down and having a meal with another was equivalent to having some degree of fellowship with that individual. They couldn't stand the idea that this man who's supposed to be from God is not acting godly, in their minds at least. They don't view him as acting godly. How could he have fellowship with these kind of people? Here is Jesus inviting all, particularly those who have a terrible reputation and in their community. These are individuals that did not want Jesus giving attention to those people that needed Jesus. Isn't that a shame? Here's his response. Let me ask you, did Jesus condone their lifestyle when he sat down to eat with them? No, right? In fact, what did he call them? Sinners, right? He did not condone their lifestyle by investing in a relationship with them, sitting down to eat with them. He did see the prospect of the sinners making a change to the point of being righteous. They could change. He saw them as being emotionally and spiritually and socially sick, but he had the remedy for their sickness, this sickness of sin. And we see two things here. We see sinners gravitating to Jesus. You have many tax collectors and sinners that are eating with him. They're gravitating to Jesus. But why? Why are they gravitating to Jesus? Because Jesus gravitated to them. They sat down with Jesus because Jesus sat down with them. Why? Because he could change their lives and their ways. Jesus doesn't seem to be afraid of being contaminated by these people. While Jesus is with the tax collectors and sinners, you can drop down to Mark 4 and look at the company that he's keeping. He's with Elijah and Moses. How can a physician help the sick if he doesn't spend time with the sick? How can a surgeon help people that will not perform surgery? Then he will not perform surgery on the people. How can a surgeon be beneficial to people if he doesn't perform the surgeries? We need encouragement in the church. We need to build each other up. We need to encourage each other. But I wonder if at times we just spend all of our time telling each other how good we are, and hardly any time at all going to the people that really, we all need Jesus, but the people that are still lost in their sin. You need to build each other up. You need to encourage each other. Absolutely. But what are we doing that has intense and intentional focus on the sinners of our community? Something to think about. It's not that's rhetorical. It's just I want you to think about that. Sometimes we pat each other on the back because we preach sound doctrine. Well, that's great. We need to preach sound doctrine, but we got to go to the lost too. So what are we doing in that respect? Jesus went to the people. We will not reach the lost if we plan to evangelize the people that come to us. What did Jesus do? He went to the people. And what resulted from that? The people ended up going to him. Too often we just sit back and wait for people to come to us. And then we try to make a decision on, well, somebody needs to go talk to them. We need to be going to the people too. Thoughts before we kind of continue through? We're about to shift to the what we learned from Jesus portion here, but this is what we learn about him. Oh, Brother Bob, go ahead. Yeah, evangelism is one sinner helping another sinner. Jesus wasn't a sinner, but us, we are all sinners. And we are not better than anyone else. And we need to be going to the people that don't know Jesus so they have the opportunity. They might reject it. They might say no. I doubt that every single person that Jesus sat down to eat with ended up becoming a follower of Jesus. Maybe they did. We don't know. We don't have record of that. But did that stop Jesus from giving them a chance? He still sat down. He still ate with them. He still invested in them and gave them some time. There is no lost cause. It's not our call to make. It's give people a chance. God will give the increase when that seed finds a good heart, when it finds the good soil, but we don't get to determine if the soil's good. We're not soil samplers and testers. We're sowers. We just go and take the seed, and then we let God give the increase. This is what we learn about him, about Jesus in these verses that we just read. We see sinners gravitating towards Jesus, and we see Jesus gravitating towards them, trying to change their lives from wrong to right. That's what we see here. So what do we learn from him? Let's spend our last bit of time that we have. We've got about 15 minutes or so. Let's see. About 10 to 15 minutes. Let's spend the last little bit of our time trying to figure that out. What do we learn from Jesus? Even though there was a crowd all around, he still saw Levi. We have to see the one in the midst of the many. You remember Jairus? the guy that was a synagogue official pretty high up, and his daughter was about to take her last breath. She hadn't just taken it yet when he came to Jesus, but he came to Jesus, and Jesus was, again, surrounded by people, and Jairus got his attention. Jesus gave him his attention. And so, remember, as he's going with this man whose name we know to help him with his daughter who was about to die, the woman that has the issue of blood that's been going on for 12 years had crawled through the crowd just to touch the hem of his garment. And it says that he feels power leave him, and she's healed. And he turns around and he asks, "Who touched me?" Well, it's kind of humorous that he asked that question to the disciples, because the apostles are basically like, "Who touched you? Take your pick." Right? There's a lot of people around here. Anybody could have touched you. But then he ends up taking his focus for a moment. He took it from the crowd and gave it to Jairus, and then he took it from Jairus for a moment and gave it to this woman whose name we don't know. We know that she was sick and she needed healing, and she had great faith that Jesus could provide the healing. And Jesus gave her his attention. A woman in that culture, in that society, whose name we don't know, that everybody, because of the particular issue she was having, everybody else would have viewed her similar to like leprosy. They wouldn't go around her. They would be afraid they would catch what she has. They would view her as a reject and someone that didn't belong. And so they would avoid looking at her. They would avoid going near her. They wouldn't sit anywhere she had sat, nothing like that. And so she's like a leper. And this woman who was like that, Jesus gave her attention. He saw her. He saw Matthew among the many. He saw Jairus among the many. He saw Zacchaeus in the tree in Luke 19. And what was there? Why did Zacchaeus climb a tree in the first place? Because the crowd. He couldn't get through the crowd to see Jesus. So Jesus is able to see the one amongst the many. The question for us is, can we see the one in the midst of the many? We have to if we're going to make friends and influence people and inspire the lives of others. In verses 13 through 15, we read a lot about the many, the crowd, and tucked away is Levi. Have you ever thought about how the first book of our New Testament wouldn't even exist if it weren't for that very moment? Who wrote Matthew? That's not a trick question. You can answer it out loud. Matthew, whose name is Levi. If that moment doesn't happen, this moment that we read in Mark 2, if that moment, verse 13 to 15, if that doesn't happen, Matthew's not the first book of our New Testament. Think about that for a moment. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's all because Jesus dared to give his attention to the one in the midst of the many. Luke 15 is all about this, isn't it? There are 3 stories in Luke 15. And in Luke 15, remember who he's speaking to? Tax collectors and sinners. But there's 3 stories there. We know one extremely well, the prodigal son. And then there's the widow that loses the money. Then there's the man who lost the sheep. And it was all 3 of those are about being able to see the one and focus on the one and find the one, right? Jesus, in sitting down to eat with them, was not condoning their actions. He was just eating with them. We have to be in the lives of people to influence the lives of people. You cannot influence someone if you do not invest in them, if you're not with them, if you're not in their life. We're going to encounter some unsavory people of our own. In fact, you probably have. More than one, most likely. Evangelism is countercultural, so it's going to create some unique and uncomfortable situations at times. So here's some lessons we learned from Jesus. Number 1, see one in the midst of the many. We have to be able to do that. Number 2, turn a deaf ear to the guilt by association critics. There are people that size us up by those they see us with. That's what's happening here with Jesus. What in the world is the Son of God, or the Son of Man, doing with legalized extortionists and prostitutes and sinners? Why is he over there? We should not sort and segregate people into categories. Jesus called them sinners. He didn't mince his words. But he also saw them as being potentially righteous. How are they going to get that way? They need a physician. So he gave them his time. You sing a song. Do you realize what you're singing? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that what? Saved a wretch like me. This whole guilt by association can be a form of prejudice. What concept do you get when you look at the word prejudice? If you break the word down, prejudice, prejudge. Prejudge. You size someone up before data is actually studied, and that's what happens with guilt by association. Sometimes somebody might see you eating with someone, and immediately they will jump to conclusions or say something because they saw you eating with that person. Why do we do that? Why do people do that? Why do we jump to those conclusions? To give us something to talk about? Yeah, so the whole watch who you're associating with so that they couldn't do that. But, you know, you think about it, how could Jesus get to these people if he doesn't stop and sit down to eat with the people, right? And so for us, I'm not saying to go put yourself in really difficult situations and say, oh, I'm just trying to... We got to be careful with that too. Don't be, unintelligent in the situation. But just because you go to eat with someone or you have a conversation with someone or someone else does, it doesn't mean anything until you have data and facts to back up whatever you might be thinking. Just be careful. I don't know if we realize one of the biggest sins that plagues the church, and people have this problem and don't even know it, is gossip. Gossip. We create stories that aren't true and create division as a result. And then we expect to somehow get to the lost, and that just doesn't happen. Now, you do need to be careful who you associate with. You do need to be careful where you associate yourself, like where you find yourself going and spending your time. We're not saying any of that. But we are saying that we got to get into the lives of people. And Jesus did that by sitting down to eat with them, by going to them. And we got to go to these people. We open up the benevolence, but again, in opening up our benevolence, we're asking everybody to come here to do that. That's one really good thing. But we still have the other component of what are we going to do in addition to this that's going to people, right? And so that's kind of what we're thinking about with this. To be a true disciple, it involves using our resources here, like benevolence. What a great blessing. Like having a trunk or treat for the community to come and be involved. Those are great things. But then also going out, going to people and saying, hey, you know, what if we come to you for this? Or we want you to know that this is going on. And so there's ways we could do that. No one is too bad to change. We all have a past, and Jesus has come to address our past. Jesus gave his attention to the tax collectors and the sinners in this passage. These individuals all had a sordid past. Paul had a sordid past. It's okay to come to Jesus with a past. I have to learn to see someone for whom they can become, not what they have been. There are two words in the New Testament that are actually that are used in the area of influence. One is the idea of a measuring vessel, like a measuring cup. And another is like a straight cane used as a measuring rod, like a yardstick. So we could say, we would say your life is a measuring cup, your life is a yardstick that others are going to measure their lives by. The word influence, the idea, the power to inspire people. The power to inspire. There was an epitaph that was on a gravestone, on this couple's child's gravestone. This is what it read: "It was easier to be good when she was around." Now, a question for you and me. Can people say that about us? It was easier to be good when he or she was around. So here's our challenge. We've looked at what we learned about Jesus. We've looked at what we learned from him. I want to give us a challenge, okay? 1 Corinthians 11:1. You remember what it says? This is Paul to the church at Corinth. I'll start it, see if you can finish it. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. So if you want to go over there and underline, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. Influence is the power to inspire. Ask yourself, what would my neighborhood, my church family, my family be like if they were all